Hello and welcome back. We're continuing our interview with Dr. Jonathon Beeke. Last time we talked about historical theology and the usage of it for the church, and a little bit of a pop quiz on people in church history.
Throwing me curveballs.
Yeah. I am not as well versed in Francis Turretin, so I don't think I can come up with any curveballs, but who knows? So Francis Turretin, you have 3 volumes. They're worked with. I took a little bit of your class on Francis Turretin.
That's right, you did.
A while back, so I'm a little, sparkled from that class. Can you explain us a little bit of where Francis Turretin was, what he did, and why he wrote these books?
Francis Turretin was a theologian pastor, born in 1623, died in 1687. He taught at Genevan Academy nearly 100 years after Calvin in the same chair of theology at Calvin. And his magnum opus, or his greatest work, would be, these 3 volumes, the Institutes of Elenctic Theology. Yes,
what does that mean?
It's a mouthful, right? Institutes of Elenctic Theology. So it's 3 volumes where he works through. It's sort of like a systematic theology, but not exactly. Elenctic simply means a polemical or disputational theology, where he's addressing the opponents of his day, largely Roman Catholics, Socinians, Lutherans, any others that he would dispute with in his theology.
So how does he go about it? Does he do question answer, or does he set things up, or?
Yep. So he divided it into 20 different loci, or places of theology,
We're going
categories of theology, and then he would do it in terms of a question. He would raise a question, a disputed question of his day, and then he would answer that question. And sort of kind of moderating often between extreme positions, maybe an extreme position on one hand, held by, let's say, the Lutherans, as what he thought, and maybe an extreme position on the other hand, held by, let's say, the Socinians, for example. And then he would moderate those extremes and list sort of objections that were raised on one side, maybe objections on the other side, and then go to Scripture and find different sources to answering the question.
That's such careful thinking.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to really. I mean, I think that's, nowadays a lot of times people are so busy with what they think that there's no more any room for listening to what others think and try to respond to that. Yeah. So is it like the Summa from Aquinas? Because does he respond to that in any way, or?
The model that he uses is very close to the Summa in terms of how Thomas worked through his theology. In fact, many of the questions were divided into four parts. Yeah. They would. I can give you the Latin terms. I don't know if you want them, but the status questionis, the state of the question. He would raise the question, ask the question, define the question, and say, here's what we're asking. We're not asking this question. We're not asking this question. In fact, almost doing away with any red herrings. Yeah. Often, polemics or controversial questions, what happens is people will go after red herrings. Yeah. And they'll say, they get stuck on this particular aspect of the question. Well, he moderates those extremes, much like Thomas did as well, and say, we have to precisely ask the question that we're asking before we get to the answer. Which it might sound strange.
It's like the way a grandfather answers the question of a grandchild.
Yes. Like, now, what are you asking, son?
So when we talk about Turretin using the same form as Thomas Aquinas, what areas would you say that he interacts the most?
So he won't necessarily quote Thomas or exactly rely often on his theology, but in terms of method of doing theology, right? Really, it's relying on scholastic method and we were talking about asking the right questions, the status questionis, so figuring out what precise question to be asked first before coming to the answer, right? And so that's the kind of first part. Then he would list out all the, and so both Thomas and Turretin will follow this method.
Yeah.
Then they will list out the objections by their opponents. Only then will you get to what's called the sed contra, or the but on the contrary.
Yeah.
And then
Thanks
that's
for translating it for me,
that's,
so I understand
that's
too.
precisely where you get the position of both Thomas and Turretin.
Yes.
So they raise the question, they sort of narrow the question to ask precisely this, they list all the objections, and only then do they get to stating their position to answering the question. And then at the end, they get to the what's called the fontes solutionum, the fount of solution, all the proofs for answering the question the way that they did answer the question. Okay. And that's where you get all their exegesis, their reliance on the early church fathers, their reliance, doctrinal statements, all of that. Logical reasons why they're holding to that position. And so you see this same mirror in the scholastic way that Thomas has done it, but also the scholastic way that Francis Turretin did it as well.
So why did they do this? Because for modern readers, it seems a little, is tedious the right word? Like it takes some patience to gain the treasures.
Yeah.
Why did they do it?
It might seem painstaking, but it's worthwhile in the end. You remember that Turretin is doing this in the face of opposition. It's a polemical theology. He's answering his opponents. What might raise controversy, even in the church today, opposition in the church today? I'm convinced that it's imprecise definitions that often raise conflict. You might assume that I mean X by this term or this category, and I might assume something completely different. And so we start talking about it. We have very different different views. We're not precise in our definition. We're not precise in our term, in the way that we handle something. So that's why it's very important for Turretin is to first state precisely the definitions, the terms that he's using. Again, we're not asking this question, we're not asking this question, we're asking this question, and we're using these precise terms and definitions to do so. And so that kind of walls out any misinterpretation, right? And which often misinterpretation leads to more conflict. And so that's why he's using that method.